This is a bit of a makeup lecture for Philosophy 1, Las Positas College, Body and Soul, Parts 1 and 2. We started our class discussion by talking about the body and the soul, students' ideas about what these might be, and their ideas about their relationship to each other. Talking about the nature of the body and soul, we pointed out that some mysteries have emerged as persistent mysteries. One of these is the body and the soul. How do they communicate? Many people will say the body is a physical thing, while the soul is a mental or spiritual thing. One difficulty this creates is answering the question of how do these two relate to each other if they're two different things. Another question is, why are we free? If the body is a physical thing and follows physical laws, how is the body involved in free choices? If free choice means I do what I do because I choose it and not as a product of the physical laws which govern nature. We'll talk about both of these things more as we move forward. So our first thinker, going back to ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, was the thinker Lucretius. We have reading from Lucretius in the textbook, and here you will see that Lucretius argues for materialism. Materialism is the view that everything in the world, everything that exists, is physical. Lucretius, following Democritus, would often say, all that exists is atoms and the void. In other words, just small things out of physical stuff and then the space through which they travel. We also said that Lucretius, like Democritus before him, was an atomist. An atomist is someone who believes that everything is made up of small and indivisible parts. So an atom in our sense of atom in physics today is no longer considered to be atomic, right? Because atoms can be broken up into smaller bits. But what it means by definition to be atomic is just to say that it's something that can't be broken up. So for Lucretius, we'll see in the reading, the world is made up of these small, indivisible things that can't be broken up any further, and everything is made of this physical stuff. So how do souls fit in? I showed this image during our discussion to illustrate the way Democritus and Lucretius think about atoms. So one of these is a soul atom, one is a metal atom, and one is a pepper atom. As you might guess, the one here on the left, this is a metal atom. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but if you can see it well enough, you can see that there are some structurally organized little atoms here with hooks and what look almost like wires connecting them, right? So Lucretius is trying to use the observable properties of something like a metal. It's malleable, but it sticks together, and explain this with the atomic structure. Some 2,000 years before contemporary science, not a bad job. The next one is a pepper atom. And the way that Lucretius describes this, it's clear that what he's trying to illustrate is that the reason that peppers taste spiky is because they spike our tongue. They give us that spiky flavor. On the other hand, soul atoms, these are the round atoms that are very small. They're round and small because they pass through the rest of our body. So the soul is a physical thing that passes through the rest of our bodies, made up of these small soul particles, and everything like our sensation on our fingers and hands involves our soul particles for Lucretius being activated and communicating that to the rest of my soul, mind, consciousness. So Lucretius goes on to argue that we can know the soul as a part of our body and gives at least two reasons for this. One is, he points out, that if we're physically hurt, our minds are harmed as well. Why would it be that physically hurting ourselves, especially something like the brain, we would say today, results in our minds and our thinking being harmed? If the two are separate and distinct things, why would hurting the body hurt the mind? A second point he makes is that our souls mature with the proper maturation of our bodies. So if something goes wrong physically with, let's say, the maturation of our brain, that can also affect the maturation of our minds. Why are these two so closely linked, argues Lucretius, if they're not just the same thing, so that the development of the body is just one part of the development of the soul, because the soul is just one part of the body. So if your body doesn't develop correctly, your soul doesn't develop correctly as just one aspect of your body. So that's our representative of physicalism, atomism, materialism. Physicalism and materialism just mean the same thing, that everything in the world is physical. Atomism is his further view that everything is made up of small individual parts, both bodies and souls, and for that matter, even things like gods. For him, gods do exist, but they are physical stuff, just like we are physical stuff, just of a higher kind. We contrasted this overall view then with Plato's view, which is a form of dualism. Dualism is a view that there exist two kinds of things, physical bodies and non-physical souls. The nature of the soul for Plato is that the soul is an eternal thing in the past and the future, and the soul is completely non-physical. In other words, the soul has always existed into the past and will always exist into the future. In the Phaedo, where you have a reading from the textbook, Plato tells us some things that should sound familiar, given the discussion that we had about rationalism a few units back. So remember that Plato argued there, perfection, even things as simple as we said, like the perfect triangle. Plato talks about perfect justice and then equality, literally like mathematical equality. He claims that these things exist only in the realm of ideas. We saw there's no such thing as a perfect equilateral triangle on the world. That's just an idea that we apply to physical things which never perfectly approximate the ideas. Plato also pointed out there, as you hopefully remember, that the world is full of things like lust, imperfection, and ignorance. And so Plato thinks rationalism is the way to go, focusing on our minds, our mentality, and higher spiritual and ideational things is the right way to perfect ourselves, because our body itself is ignorant, full of lust and greed and imperfection. There's a reading as well from the Phaedo in the section of the textbook, and that's another of Plato's works. And here Plato argues that the body itself should be thought of as an imprisoning cage for the soul. So the body is like a prison in which the soul is trapped. And the body is responsible for our evil and ignorance. So you remember that for Plato, your soul has always existed. It's a perfect representation of what it is as a mental thing or as an idea. It's not perfect the way, for Plato, God would be perfect. But it's perfect in the sense that you are the perfect, limited being that you're supposed to be. But when you're born to earth, corrupted with the body, your soul doesn't perceive itself correctly because it's mixed with the physical stuff. So the solution to this tragic union of the body and the soul, well, over many lifetimes, Plato suggests, we can purify our mind from our body and then return to the heaven of eternal ideas. What does that mean, to purify our mind from our body? It means that for Plato, while we're living here on earth, what we're focusing on is higher things. Things like mathematics, which have a perfection to them that isn't found on earth. Things like human virtue, which strives to make us behave in such a way that tells us what we ought to be and doesn't look at things the way they are. So striving for these higher things, these spiritual values, over many lifetimes, we will remain in heaven just as the idea, as the spiritual thing that we are, and not be corrupted again by the body. but this takes many lifetimes. Somewhere else, for example, Plato talks about how someone died and they had been a prisoner. And when they got to the place of judgment after their life, they were asked by the powers that be, well, what do you want to be now? And I remember someone choosing, he was a prisoner and he chose to be a bird because he was still focused. He was still caught in a life where he lived as a prisoner and he wanted to be free, but he wanted to be free in a physical sense. The right answer for Plato, for what do you want to be when you get sent back to earth, is I don't want to get sent back to earth at all because I've purified my mind from my body. I just care about spiritual things and I'm ready to go past earthly living and just live in the realm of ideas. Now, there's some other readings from Plato here talking about the nature of the soul, and one of these other readings comes from the Phaedrus. Now, in the Phaedrus, Plato represents the soul and says that the soul has 3 parts. One part of the soul is an unruly and an impetuous horse. One part is a noble and upright horse. And then there's also one part of us is the charioteer trying to decide what to do with that horse, right? The noble and upright horse is trying to lead us up to heaven. It's trying to get us to do the right thing. The impetuous and unruly horse, that's trying to lead us down to earth. Or I suppose if it keeps winning, maybe to something like a hell. And we, with these 2 parts of our soul, try to decide which to follow. If we follow the right one, we're led up. If we follow the wrong one, we're led down. Now this is kind of strange in a way, right? Because Plato had already said in many other works that the soul by its nature, by its essence, is actually a pure thing, and it's just the body that corrupts the soul. So it's very hard to make these 2 really fit together. On this view, the soul has an unruly and ignoble and impure part. On Plato's overall view, it's just the body that's impure, pulling the soul down. So when we fall to earth, the unruly horse wins. We fall to the level of the physical world. It's easier to see how this model would fit with something like the person who was being in the afterlife after death and being asked how he wants to go back, right? That person still has the unruly part of him pulling him down to earth and the higher part that should be directing him elsewhere. So after we discussed these models of the soul, one of them being the one that really dominates Plato's thinking, which is the soul is this absolutely pure thing corrupted by earthly things, and then this other story about the horse, which is kind of difficult really to fit in with the rest of his discussion, we looked at some arguments for the immortality of the soul. So one of these we reduced to the idea that Plato argues the soul is by definition the principle of life. And for this reason, the soul can't be something that's dead. The basic argument as we worked it out seems to be something like that the soul is the principle of life. From an ancient Greek point of view, the soul is what takes a dead body and gives it life. So how can a soul be dead if it's inherently a principle of life? Life can't be dead, so the soul must live on forever. A second argument we spent quite a bit of time working on this in class, is the idea that the soul is the principle of motion within the body. If you go back and read the selection, you can just find it in your text. You'll see that Plato argues that the soul is something which is within us and can move us physically, even though nothing physical moves the soul. So the soul is a self-moving principle, and because all motion comes from other motion, Plato ends up arguing that the soul had to exist forever so that it could be continuously a cause of self-motion, so that there is no beginning and end of motion. All motion causes other motion and comes from other motion. Therefore, the soul must exist as this principle of self-propelling motion. If motion can have no beginning or end, then the soul, as a principle of self-motion, must have always existed. to cause itself, and for that reason, no matter what physical happens, the soul will continue as a cause of itself, because even though the soul can cause things to move physically, nothing physically causes the soul to move. We spent about 40 minutes in class trying to work out what this argument is, and we talked about some reasons for thinking it might be a good argument and also some objections. We could paraphrase this by saying something like the soul is the principle of movement in the body, and so the soul must be eternal. We said much more than this in class, and feel free to go back to the account given here and work out some of the subtlety for yourself. All right, so that's Lucretius, who's a materialist, a monist, a physicalist. Monist just means there's one thing that Lucretius believes exists. That's the physical world. We saw Plato, who's a dualist. There's two totally different kinds of things. A soul is a spiritual thing. It's an idea. It's a mental thing. And the physical world is the corrupt world into which that soul is trapped. Aristotle was Plato's student, and he did not define the soul as some separate thing from the body with its own existence. For Aristotle, the soul is seen as a special function of a body. Famously, Aristotle argues that there are several types of souls, several types of abilities or functions that special creatures have, in virtue of which they are those creatures, and these special abilities for Aristotle really just are the soul of the thing. So a plant for Aristotle has a soul. That soul is nothing but the ability to grow and use nutrition to develop into the plant that it is. Self-sustaining as long as it has those other things to allow it to grow. It's that principle which is its soul. An animal soul is also not something separate, something outside, something spiritual. An animal soul is just the special function that animal bodies have, which for Aristotle is the ability to follow something like desire and move in order to achieve those desires. So animals have desires for things like food. They can move to get that food, and that's sort of their function for Aristotle. The function of an animal is to move toward food, meet those desires, move toward reproductive capacity, and achieve that capacity. Human souls for Aristotle are different. Humans are a very special kind of physical animal. Humans are a kind of animal with the ability to reason. That's our unique gift. Now, humans have the ability to reason. Of course, they also have what the animal soul has. We have the ability to move and desire. We have what plants have. We have the abilities of growth and nutrition. But the ability to reason is what sets us as separate. And our soul is nothing but our reasoning capacity, which is made possible by our body. Notice that for Aristotle, souls are not a separate thing from the body, but they're also not a part of a body, right? Your soul isn't some part of the body I could identify and cut out of you. It's just a special capacity your body has when it's organized correctly. So the soul is a special ability of the body. And in general, for Aristotle, this implies that the afterlife is not really a thing for us. Maybe it's the way people remember us in the afterlife, something like that. Sometimes when he's speaking more metaphysically, maybe under the influence of Plato, he seems to suggest that because God is this eternal, rational principle, to the degree that your eternal, rational essence is exemplified by your mind, that might have an eternal existence. But it's not like an individual existence, you and your personality that will go on. Your capacity to reason dies with your physical body, and in that sense it disappears except as a memory and an effect that could be in the lives of others and other rational beings. Okay, there's Lucretius, the materialist, Plato, the dualist, and Aristotle, we might call him something like a functionalist. Your soul is just a function of a physical animal, the function of reason. And then Descartes. So Descartes was also a dualist, but Descartes is a dualist during a time of the scientific revolution. He was a big part of the scientific revolution. He had theories of physics and astronomy and mathematics that were very influential and very important in the development of science during the scientific revolution. So we're in the 1600s here. And Descartes started to recognize that the way the human body works is largely, especially when we're thinking about the brain, as a physical system, as a mechanistic system. The body is kind of like a machine. Here you can see the eyes going back, the ocular nerves, what might be the visual or motor cortex back here, and the way that's related to send messages to the muscles like the bicep here, the way light is coming into the eye and refracting back to the retina here. And so the human body is starting to look like a physical system, like a machine. Descartes recognized that the brain is receiving impressions and transmitting messages. At the same time, the scientific view of what a body, a physical body is, just meaning like a physical thing in general, is starting to develop. Bodies, Newton was working on the same thing, are made out of physical stuff, and they follow physical laws. If one billiard ball hits another billiard ball, that second billiard ball moves away at an angle and at a rate and with a momentum that's based on the elasticity of the balls and the momentum of the ball and the angle of incidence on the second ball. And these things follow physical laws, and they're going to happen every time in the same situation because physical laws determine and constrain what physical things are going to do. That's how laws of nature work. So how then does Descartes fit a soul into this picture? Well, Descartes says that a soul, it's a non-physical thing, just like Plato here. It's a thing that contains our feelings and sensations, and it makes our decisions. When we're thinking, making choices, our soul does that. Now we saw, when we were talking about something like the scientific view of body, doesn't that suggest that everything my body does is the result of physical laws rather than choice? How is my soul interacting with my body, this physical system? And this was a problem for Descartes. Descartes does end up saying, well, I found a place where they interact. That place where they interact, he famously postulates, is the pineal gland. The pineal gland, when he describes it, he said, well, it's just in the center of the brain, and it's made up of one part rather than two, and the soul is made up of one part. The soul is singular, so that's a good place to say they connect. Sort of a one-off for Descartes, really. He doesn't have a great explanation for why he chose it, and it's a location, really, more than it is an explanation, right? Because it's difficult to say, once you have a physical system following physical laws, how could a non-physical soul even interact with that physical system? Descartes' solution isn't really a solution. It's a location, but that's about it. Interestingly, we know now that pineal gland is actually involved in things like dream and waking states and consciousness, which has led to many people kind of speculating about the place the pineal gland might have. But for Descartes, it was really just, well, it's in the middle, it's singular, it seems like a good place to think it might interact, but it's not really an explanation for how the physical and the non-physical could relate to each other or could behave, given that one follows physical laws and one is a non-physical thing. So Descartes says, as you continue in the reading, that he also has found for himself a proof that his soul is distinct from his body. This should take us back as well to Descartes' Meditations, which we covered in our last unit, where Descartes says, okay, at one point, if you remember back in that previous lesson, Descartes had said, I can imagine that everything I'm experiencing is a dream, or it's all deception from some great, powerful creature. How do I know anything's real? He concludes, I know I exist because I'm thinking, so even if I'm deceived about everything else, I still exist in order to be deceived. So I know for sure I exist, even if I don't have a body, even if there is no physical world. Descartes concludes from this, well, if I know that I exist as a mind, but for all I know I could not be a body at all, then the mind must be essentially what I am. I'm essentially a soul, which is not a body and is distinct from a body. We talked in class about some possible problems with this argument, but that's the argument that he brings up. He also says that once you've described the soul in this way, the idea that the soul is eternal comes sort of for free. If the soul is this independent thing that isn't affected by the body, it's a purely spiritual thing, a purely mental thing, then even if the body passes away, the soul, which I'm directly aware of by my consciousness, is something that's not going to be harmed by physical things because it's not made out of physical stuff. So the soul can continue even if the body decays. So it's another form of dualism, not entirely dissimilar from that of Plato, but it's modified with more contemporary, or at least modern, scientific ideas of how the body works and how physical things work. Okay, so we've talked about Lucretius and his materialism. We've talked about Plato and Plato's dualism. We've talked about Aristotle, his functionalism. We've looked at the more modern dualism of Descartes. And now we're making our way, and if you're following your sheets, this is another sheet that was handed out, to talk about more contemporary scientific views. So making our way into the 20th century here, as science really starts to develop as the science of behavior, and minds start to be understood more and more as physical systems, and philosophers and psychologists alike both become more and more apprehensive about talking about things that can't be observed physically. How do we understand a human, a personality, a mind, if we're not willing to speculate about things that we can't see? This is the big question, and these views we'll discuss next are all ways of talking about what a mind and a person are, what we mean when we use mental language, because all of them are influenced by science in a way where they're not willing to say we can talk about things we can't see. But generally speaking, your mind, your thoughts, your mental states are things we can't see. If we can't see them, if we can't probe them, if we can't illustrate them and interact with them in the physical world, what are we even saying when we say we have minds or mental states? That's the big question. So one of the readings you have here comes from Gilbert Ryle. Ryle's a logical behaviorist. A logical behaviorist is someone who believes that when we talk about things like souls, minds, or beliefs, these are all mental states, right? All we could really mean by that, it has to be something we can observe. And so it must just be our tendencies to act in a certain way. No ghost in the machine, if you will. There's no invisible thing we're going to speculate about that we can't observe. We can observe things in the physical world, and if we can observe them, we have evidence that they're there. So what would it mean to take a mental state and to just say a mental state is nothing but a behavioral state? Well, you can imagine something like thirsty. What does it mean to be thirsty? If I'm a behaviorist, I won't say it's an invisible thing inside of your mind. I'll say, well, to be thirsty is just to have a tendency to drink when water is available. Maybe it has to get a bit more complex than that. To be happy is just to, well, while you're sitting in class, you're smiling, you're facing forward, you're paying attention and alert. Although paying attention and alert sound a bit like mental predicates, so let's say you're responsive to questions and you volunteer to answer questions, because those are things that are directly observable. So I can tell a thirsty student by their tendency to drink. I can tell a happy student by their tendency to smile and interact. And not only can I tell that a student is thirsty or happy, but for the behaviorist, that's all there is to thirst. There's no additional thing. It's not just that the thirst shows you're happy. it's not just that the drinking or the tendency to drink shows you're thirsty. It's that that's all thirst is, the tendency to drink. All happiness is the set of behaviors and behavioral tendencies that we associate with happiness. There's no additional thing. You're a happy person if you tend to smile, laugh, interact in a way that's energetic when you encounter other people. Now, behaviorism is not just a philosophical view of how to understand the mind. It's also a therapeutic view that gets developed by psychology. So let's think about something like a fear of spiders, a phobia. The behaviorist is going to say that a maladaptive mental state, like being so afraid of spiders I can't go outside, is a mental state. And so that mental state, when defined by the behaviorist, is just going to be something like arachnophobia is just when I see a spider, I get paralyzed, I scream, I can't act, and maybe I start to shake. So arachnophobia isn't a mental state separate from a behavioral state. Arachnophobia is just having a tendency to behave in these maladaptive ways when there's a spider present or there could be a spider present. So from this point of view, trauma is just, or arachnophobia is just, a set of maladaptive behaviors. So when it comes to treating those behaviors, a behaviorist is going to try to get rid of those behaviors because there's nothing more to a maladaptive mental state than a set of behaviors. So if arachnophobia is just a tendency to shake and run when I see a spider, the behaviorist is going to cure arachnophobia by trying to make it so that new behaviors replace the maladaptive behaviors. The new behaviors in the case of arachnophobia might be things like remaining calm, keep walking, and not running inside when I see a spider. So a behaviorist who's also a psychologist, a clinical or therapeutic psychologist, might sit me down and slowly expose me to spiders and teach me a new behavior, which is the behavior of not running away, remaining seated, and carrying on with my day. So from this perspective, if I'm a behaviorist, what the mental state was just a tendency for these maladaptive behaviors. So if you replace that with adaptive behaviors, then I will have been cured. You can see reasons why someone might be uncomfortable with a behavioral reduction of our mental state to a purely behavioral state. One thing that we might point out as an objection is just that we can have a behavioral state without the corresponding mental state. A similar point, but also distinct, is that we can have a mental state without the corresponding behavioral state. So for the first, the behavioral state without the mental state, I could be drinking just because I'm nervous and I want something to do with my hands, even though I'm not in the mental state of being thirsty. When it comes to having the mental state, I could be very thirsty, but not drinking because I'm not sure that the water is safe and I don't trust the person who gave it to me. So it seems like there's easy ways in which our behavioral state and our mental state can separate, suggesting that they're not the same thing. When it comes to something like a therapeutic response, someone might argue, well, even if you cured me of the behavior, does that mean that you cured me as well of the mental state? Because couldn't I still have that same mental state even if the behavioral state was gone? I'm still deathly afraid of spiders even though I've learned to act in such a way as if I wasn't. All right, so that's behaviorism. It's one scientific attempt to take what seems like a mental predicate, a mental state, and be able to talk about mental states as things we can observe, because more and more philosophers, psychologists, and even for that matter physicists started saying we can't talk about things as if we could know about things that no one can experience by observation. A good theory, said a lot of these scientifically minded people, has to be a theory that only includes entities and things we can observe. We can't know anything about things if we can't observe them, then it's just made up. So one way to take our mind, our mentality, and reduce it to something observable is to say mental states are really just tendencies to behave in certain ways. Because I can observe your behavior, that means I can observe your mind, because your mind is nothing more but a bunch of tendencies to behave in a certain way. Your mind is just a set of behavioral tendencies. The next one of these scientific readings comes from Smart. And Smart is not a behaviorist, he's a mind-body reductionist. A mind-body reductionist is another way to try and take our mentality and reduce our mentalities to something that can be scientifically observed. Rather than saying that our mind is nothing more than tendencies to behave in a certain way, the mind-body reductionist says that your mind is nothing other than your brain state. Here's just one example of what a brain scan might look like with the various things that go on in your brain. And your mind is nothing other than what your brain is doing from a scientific neurobiological point of view. Your brain is your mind. And so everything that you call a mental state is just a state of your brain. It's a state of neurons, the cells in your brain, being activated and arranged in a certain way. And every mental state is just a brain state. We talked in class about something like the notion of love. Well, love is a mental state. What would it mean to say that love is a physiological or a brain state? I showed this scan of a brain that shows opiate receptors in the brain, and their high incidence in something like the reward centers of the brain in the middle here. Well, I might try to define love in a really simple way by saying love is nothing but the tendency to have all these opiate centers in your reward centers of your brain, to have these opiate neurons activated in the presence of someone is to be in love. So love is just this high activation of opiate sensitive cells in the brain. That's what love is. Love's a physiological state of your brain that your brain gets into when let's say you're around someone, the person with which you're in love. So it's not just to say that when you're in love with someone, your brain gets activated. It's to say that love is nothing more than a brain state. There's no additional thing. It's not just that the love makes your brain get activated. It's that the brain activation is the love. Your mental state is just a physiological state. Not just that your mental state always comes with a brain state, but your mental state is nothing more than a brain state. One last theory in this lecture on our scientific account and our quick run through and review of these modern, even contemporary views of what it means to say from a scientific point of view that you're having a certain mental state or that you have a mind. The Churchlands, especially in the 80s, started promoting an idea of eliminativism. You'll see a reading from, I believe it's Paul Churchland, in the textbook. Could be Patricia. They work together. I forget which one we end up reading in the textbook there. The Churchlands argued for eliminativism. Eliminativism goes one step further than the reductionism of mind-body reductionism. Instead of reducing your mental states, let's say love, to a physiological state, like the activation of those opiate receptors in your brain, the eliminativist eliminates most of what they call folk psychology. So the eliminativist eliminates most of the way we think about ourselves and most of the way that we give ourselves mental predicates, or describe our mentality by talking about things like love, hate, desire, kindness. And it eliminates these ways because it wants to say that for the most part, these are not scientific kinds, or even not real kinds. What does it mean to say something's not a real kind? It just means it's not a real type. If I was to say something like, that kind of thing, which is my right thumb and my ear, well, that's not a kind of thing at all. That's two things I just put together. If I was to say the kind of thing which is like, I don't know, a leafcutter ant is a natural kind, because leafcutter ants all have similar properties. They're found in nature, and you can identify the specific traits which make a leafcutter ant a leafcutter ant. What the Churchlands largely argued is that our ordinary folk psychology, the way we think of ourselves as happy, loving, or angry, comes from a bunch of theories that we had before we even observed brains. And so most of our psychological theories and the way we describe ourselves as minds is going to have to be thrown out and rebuilt from scratch according to this stuff, according to how the brain actually works and how the brain actually behaves. So what we're eliminating is most of the traditional ways that we thought about what it meant to be a mind and what our mental states are, how we categorize our mental states. And instead, what we're doing is we're building things from the ground up based on actual brain science to talk about kinds. Going back to something like love being the activation of certain pleasure centers. Well, if you study people who say they're in love, it turns out that this opiate reaction, this kind of euphoric high that people get when they're in love, happens primarily within just the first few months or so in which people are in love. People who remain in love over time have different centers and different neurotransmitters being released. Things like oxytocin rather than things like dopamine. Those opiates like dopamine are being released. And so really what we think of as love is not a natural brain kind. And so the Churchlands presumably would argue, get rid of things like the notion of love as we've thought of it. Get rid of things like, we can't even reduce love to a brain state because love, as we think of it, is just a confused notion of a bunch of different brain states. At least two of those are probably the high we get when the receptors that are sensitive to opiates are activated when we first fall in love, and then the feeling of contentment we get later in a relationship when the feeling of comfort that comes with the release of oxytocin. So rather than talking about love at all, we can just talk about what actually happens to brains. Two different things at least. One thing is the state that's associated with dopamine. Another is a later state associated with oxytocin. And we wouldn't want to reduce these to the same thing and just say this is what love is. Instead, we reinvent our psychological notions by basing them on our physiological notions. We eliminate our old psychology and talk instead about here's what brains do, here's the true nature of brain functionality, and just talk about your brain. Don't throw in those old views that are ready to be thrown out because they don't match with how brains really work. As the Churchlands develop, this sort of develops in different ways, but what you'll see in the reading that we have in the textbook is a strong emphasis toward just that elimination of most of the theories that we have that are based on all these traditional ways of thinking of ourselves before we had science. So what would it look like if an eliminativist or a mind-body reductionist was going to treat a patient? Well, likely they're going to go say something like, well, what is your phobia? It's a set of fear reactions within your brain. So change the state of your brain, you're going to change your mental state. So good chance someone who's a mind-body reductionist or an eliminativist is just going to say, do something to change your brain. In theory, I suppose this could be behavioral because the behavior could change your brain state. But most obviously, it could be something like a drug. A drug interacts with the chemistry of your brain. Once the drug changes your brain state, it's also changed your mental state, right? So a therapeutic reaction to a brain organization or a set of neurochemical states that wasn't functional would be to change that neurochemistry by something like a pill. Not the only approach that could be given, but it's sort of a natural approach that falls out of this definition of what a mind is. Objections to something like mind-body reductionism could be pretty similar to those of behaviorism. Couldn't we imagine, let's say, a brain with all those exact same brain states and not still with a mind? So isn't the mind something other than just the brain? Another way to say kind of a similar problem is to say, I could tell you everything about your brain. Is that still going to show you what red looks like or what it feels like to be in love? What if you understood everything about the neurochemistry of being in love? Would that be the same thing as understanding what love is? Or is there something irreducible to the mental state, the feeling of love, being in love, that could never be captured by any neurobiological model? If so, it looks like there's more to what a mental state is than just a physiological state, just a brain state, because you can't even describe mental states in physiological terms. You can describe something about what happens to your brain, but is that really understanding what it's like to be in love or what it's like to see red? These objections could work for mind-body reductionism and some forms of eliminativism too, depending on how it was phrased. All right. Well, that's for next time. So this is a successful review of Body and Soul Part 1 and the first part of Part 2. The rest we will be talking about in class, and I may or may not have a time or a chance to make a summary of it, but hopefully this summary is useful for you, whether you're using it to catch up on some class that you missed or to review for the test.